Let's try it. Part of my task this afternoon is to tell a story, to sketch, as well as I can in a short period of time, the recent history of the discussion of the argument from miracles, at least among philosophers, with special reference to the present state of the art. But the present moment is a moving target, and the story therefore breaks off before it's completed. Before I finish, I'll glance backward at some of the earlier and largely forgotten chapters in the history of the story to see whether they can offer us some clues as to how it might unfold from here. In the middle of the 20th century, most philosophical discussions of the topic began with Hume's famous critique in his essay of miracles. And as a quick trawl through philosophy of religion anthologies will reveal, most discussions ended there as well, with perhaps a little bit of haggling over the details of how to formulate Hume's argument for modern ears. Although I was a philosophy student with more than an average interest in this subject, I cannot recall ever once being told by any of my professors that there was anything else of significance to read on the subject. After all, we were aware that people like Augustine and Aquinas might somewhere have said something about miracles, but in our post-Humean age, there was really no need to go back there. We had a silver bullet and everlasting check for all kinds of superstitious delusions. How we moved out of the philosophical steady state half a century ago into the more dynamic and expanding field of inquiry we enjoy today is an interesting question. Maybe as interesting as the question of how we got stuck in it in the first place. I think two factors are responsible for rousing philosophy out of its dogmatic slumber. The first is the modern refinement of probabilistic tools of analysis, and the second is the rediscovery of the fact that this subject has a history. The former brings us up to the present, the latter takes us back in time, but may, if I am not mistaken, help us to map the future as well. Hume's argument against miracles must be, because of his empiricism, a non-deductive argument. Beginning in the late 1960s, Bayesian methods of probabilistic analysis found their way into the philosophical mainstream, first in the philosophy of science, and shortly thereafter in philosophy of religion as well. Soon enough, Hume's admirers began to apply these methods to his famous argument, assuming that if only a few details about the proper representation of Hume's claim could be tidied up, this procedure would yield a satisfying and rigorous formulation of his objection to reported miracles. It did not. And as attempt after attempt ended in failure, a horrible suspicion arose that the reason for this might not lie in a lack of technical ingenuity on the part of Hume's advocates, but in the objection itself. By the late 1990s, this suspicion was confirmed by several different authors. Hume's objection, probabilistically formulated, does not work. The everlasting check began to look more like an urban legend. The reactions of the Humean faithful have been remarkably varied. Some have urged that Hume's argument cannot be reconstructed along Bayesian lines because, strange to relate, there is no consensus on what Hume's argument is or what he's trying to establish with it. Others have decided that despite what almost everyone had understood since the first publication of his essay, Hume never was trying to establish an absolute barrier to belief in miracles, but was just setting the bar rather high. And anyone who thinks otherwise is a gross misreader of Hume. Yet others have proposed that perhaps we can capture Hume's intention best by abandoning ordinary mathematical frameworks and adopting non-standard analysis or non-Pascalian versions of probability. Such disarray among forces that within living memory held essentially unchallenged sway over the field is astonishing. The very fact that someone has in the 21st century felt it necessary to publish a book with the title A Defense of Hume on Miracles is a testament to the magnitude of the revolution. 50 years ago, the publication of a book with such a title would have been almost as unthinkable as the fact that it was provoked by the publication by an agnostic of a book entitled Hume's Abject Failure. The recognition of the breakdown of Hume's argument under a probabilistic reconstruction has paved the way for several other developments, and I'll look at some of those now briefly. And I should make a confession at this point. I had two possible talks to give you today. One of them was deep in the weeds technical, and the other one is not. And I asked several people, and the uniform judgment was, give the popular level talk, save the tech stuff. So I am going to slip a few slides in here quickly. If you are allergic to equations, just have that Benadryl syringe handy, but they will pass very quickly. So there were some. Here's one thing that we should look at just before we begin. Arguments from miracles have to be first arguments for miracles. And to do that, we run into a problem in transitivity of confirmation. It's well known that in the probability calculus, the mere fact that testimony is evidence for a miracle, and the miracle would be evidence for the existence of God, does not entail, as a general rule, that the testimony raises the probability of God's existence. So we have right up a question here: how can we possibly argue indirectly here from something that's out at a distance? The answer, fortunately, lies in a paper published by Tomoji Shigenji in British Journal for Philosophy of Science. It turns out that transitivity does hold provided one further condition is met, and that is screening, that the truth of the miracle claim screens the testimony from the question of God's existence, so that the impact of the testimony is only through that which it is testimony for. That's a nice result, and a result that I think we should all be very happy for, because if we didn't have that result, then we would be in trouble as far as trying to construct a whole lot of different arguments not involving the philosophy of religion. We really need that transitivity to work, and I think that it can be well argued that in many cases it does. This is not a necessary condition. This is a sufficient condition. There are weaker conditions, but they can't be formulated quite as tidily. We can come back to that and talk about that if somebody wants to. So that's, okay, shot number one, math allergic people, you can open your eyes. Now, a formulation of a Hume-inspired argument can be found in several different places. You can find it in one of David Owen's papers, but I'm going to take the formulation from Mackie's book, The Miracle of Theism. Here's his summary from his first chapter of that book. It is pretty well impossible that reported miracles should provide a worthwhile argument for theism addressed to those who are initially inclined to atheism or even to agnosticism. Not only are such reports unable to carry any rational conviction on their own, but also they are unable even to contribute independently to the kind of accumulation or battery of arguments which Mackie has spoken of in the introduction to his book. Well, in probabilistic terms, what he is saying is that T could be evidence for M in the standard sense of raising the probability of M only when M already has some reasonably high probability, maybe at least as high as 0.5. There is absolutely no Bayesian rationale for that restriction. That is a piece of special pleading. And this has been known for a long time. It's been known, in fact, since the early Victorian era, when Charles Babbage wrote a book called The Ninth Bridgewater Treatise. Babbage's proof is kind of simplified. Sorry, math-phobic people, this is your cue. Little bit coming up here, and then we'll be done. Babbage points out that if you have a sufficient number of independent testimonies, each of which carries a certain amount of weight in a certain sense, namely that the likelihood ratio here, which is displaying this way, we're going to play hob with the equations because I'm on Trent's Mac. Sorry about that. But the likelihood ratio here is going to exceed 1. And these testimonies are independent, then there's a limit. Wow, Trent, we lose. Sorry about that. Limit, as the number goes to infinity, is going to be itself infinite for a very simple reason. And that reason, which you might not be able to read in here, is that n appears only in this term. It doesn't appear in this term. Here's the ratio of the prior probabilities. And the ratio of the priors completely swings free of n, whereas the ratio of the likelihoods doesn't. If they're all equal and independent, it's just k to the nth power. And as n goes to infinity, that one goes off the charts. Now we have multiple reasons for being glad that there are not many equations here. But in layman's terms, Hume was wrong. And so is Mackie. Okay, So what? Where do we go from there? Showing that Hume was wrong does not, by itself, show that theism is true or even that it's well justified or reasonable. Hume was making a rather strong claim, putting up a barrier. That can't be sustained, but it doesn't follow that there really is a good argument in the neighborhood. It's simply a matter of clearing space for the possibility. To try to show that takes historical work, and there is some good work now being done both by philosophers and by historians and theologians. So I would just name a few pieces of this. Richard Swinburne's book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate, has brought together some sensitivity to the historical material with facility with the technical side. N.T. Wright's major work, the third volume in his trilogy in particular. Richard Burridge's book, What Are the Gospels? A Comparison with Greco-Roman Biography. Very important piece of work. Baucham's work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I strongly recommend this. Baucham was trained not as a New Testament scholar, but as a historian, and came late to the study of these things. Craig Keener, The Historical Jesus of the Gospels. A brilliant piece of work, and Keener's name will come up here again. And I would also add Craig Evans, who's got many works. One of them that I've just enjoyed recently is Jesus and His World. Most of these works are not dealing with probabilistic reconstructions. They're digging into the history in a way that must be done if we're to have a responsible grasp of this kind of material. There are also three promising developments, I think, going on in the field in general. First of all, what's called ramified natural theology, and here my principal reference is Richard Swinburne Passim, because Richard, in almost everything that he has done, has had in view the connection of the traditional arguments of natural theology with the more specific claims of Christianity, and we are most fortunate indeed that he has been able to connect that arc all the way over to specific claims. The second, which I think is attracting a growing amount of attention, is the matter of contemporary miracle reports. This summer at Oxford, I had the pleasure of commenting on a paper by Craig Keener, who has done an immense amount of work pulling together contemporary reports, not just third world reports, first world reports, hospitals in Miami, documenting this to the extent that FERPA allows getting statements from doctors. And I know every time I bring this up among physicians, one or two people say, I want to talk to him. I have some stories to tell him too. Craig is not credulous. He understands that a certain amount of this may just be false positives, but the sheer mass of examples that he has brought together of things up to and including people who were dead coming back to life while being prayed over is astonishing, particularly since he puts up photographs of them and says, and I know about this one personally because the woman who was dead is my sister-in-law. It made me think that maybe I need to get out a bit more. Third, there is the application of the analysis to a wider field than simply testimony to reported miracles. There's the matter of prophecy. Hume brushes this aside in a sort of passing comment as merely another case of miracle, but of course it's very hard to point to which natural law was violated, right? People make claims and events happen. Where in all of this is a violation of a physical law? And special providences, the timing of some things, just preternatural timing. Of course, we want to acknowledge that there can be mere coincidences there, but the circumstances can give rise to some rather peculiar evidential considerations there. So that's a field that is also being worked on. When I present this to general philosophical audiences, the response is very frequently a kind of studied cynicism. I'm reminded that Hume not only wrote part one of his essay, he wrote part two. And in part two, he gives us a catalog of a posteriori reasons for doubting reported miracles. I think they can be brought pretty well under four heads. First of all, the witnesses have never been sufficiently credible or numerous, nor the supposed event done in a prominent enough part of the world. The passions of surprise and wonder move people to accept miracle reports in contradiction to their common sense. Reports of miracles are observed chiefly to abound amongst ignorant and barbarous nations. And Finally, reports of miracles in various opposing religions, if accepted as of equal credit, would cancel each other out. The fact both that these arguments still are felt to be compelling by many people and that there's an increasing retreat on the part of the Humeans to part two. Some people are explicitly saying, yeah, there wasn't a very good argument in part one, but part two, now that's where the action is, led me to think it would be worthwhile to take a trip back to the future. So I'd like to look at a few of these express claims from Hume and see what people who were his contemporaries or even his predecessors had to say about them. So, the first one, there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us against all delusion in themselves. How much good sense, education, and learning is necessary to distinguish a dead man from a living one? Did Roman soldiers know how to kill a man? Would intimate friends of a man know whether he was alive and speaking to them or whether that was someone else? Now, on this, I really like a comment from Thomas Sherlock, and before I even quote it, I want to go down here to the bottom and note 1729. Some of you will alertly recognize that Hume was about 18 years of age at this point. So it's not a response to Hume. It's an anticipation. A man rising from the grave, Sherlock writes, is an object of sense and can give the same evidence of his being alive as any other man in the world can give. So that a resurrection considered only as a fact to be proved by evidence is a plain case. It requires no greater ability in the witnesses than that they are able to distinguish between a man dead and a man alive. And he goes on. And this is, I think, quite interesting because in his book, A Defense of Hume on Miracles, Robert Fogelin has argued that Hume's great contribution was to tell us that it takes more evidence in these cases than in others. So look what Sherlock was writing in 1729. I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases. But it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are manifestly objects of sense. We're not talking about Chalcedonian definitions of the hypostatic union. We're talking about matters of sense. They're available to the senses. Well, but Hume goes on. We haven't had witnesses of such undoubted integrity as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others. Now, again, let's go back to the future. Robert Jenkin, writing in 1708, and that's the third edition. This is actually a 17th century work. Speaking of the first witnesses, says they had no worldly interest to advance by their testimony, but suffered by it and had a certain prospect of suffering. Now, a key point here, because people will respond, yes, and people will fly airplanes into buildings for what they believe as well. Jenkin actually discusses this, not the airplanes part, but he actually anticipates that kind of response. And he says, you're not distinguishing between people who are dying for an ideology and people who are dying for something they claim to have witnessed. Martyrs are witnesses. That's the root meaning of the term. You cannot put these together in parallel and claim that the one case undermines the other. I'll add that Jenkin has this merely as a section header in his book and then goes on to deliver a more detailed argument for this. You can probably guess where it goes. Well, but how about another consideration? There haven't been witnesses of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind as to have a great deal to lose in case of their being detected in any falsehood. Here, Hume's contemporaries turned the objection round on him. John Leland, in his view of the principal deistical writers, says, it might have been said with some show of plausibility that such persons, by their knowledge and abilities, their reputation and interest, might have it in their power to countenance and propagate an imposture among the people and give it some credit in the world. In other words, two can play at this game. If you're asking for witnesses of credit who have great standing in the world, those are also the sorts of people who are better placed to pull off a hoax. So it's not at all clear that this consideration cuts in one direction the way that Hume wants it to. Well, he has other objections, right? That's the wonderful thing about having a long catalog of these things. But let's follow him there. Second objection, if the spirit of religion join itself to the love of wonder, there is an end of common sense, and human testimony in these circumstances loses all pretensions to authority. A not very carefully veiled jab at Locke, who had a comment on this issue. But here, George Campbell, one of Hume's contemporaries, shot back. The prejudice, he says, resulting from religious affection may just as readily obstruct as promote our faith in a religious miracle. If you don't believe this, I advise you to try to get into Mecca and start a new religion there, see how far it gets you. Again, there's a lot more in Campbell on this. When I was in Belgium some 5 years ago, I spoke to Bruce Langtry about this, and Bruce was one of the few people who had actually read Campbell on miracles. And Bruce is a very mild-mannered guy, but when I brought up Campbell, he said with some vehemence, if Hume had been an honest man, when Campbell published his dissertation, Hume would have withdrawn his essay. Which I thought was a really remarkable statement, and I'm actually rather inclined to agree with him. Well, how about another objection? It is very observable that the more ignorant and barbarous any people remain, you shall find them most abound with tales of this nature, which was said by Hume? No, actually, that's John Toland from Christianity Not Mysterious, published very early in the 18th century. The objections, all of the objections preceded Hume. All of the objections were discussed before Hume. All of the things he raises had been raised by others. And frankly, people tend to forget that when Ehrman published Hume's Abject Failure, more than half of the book consists of a reprinting of historic works by Hume's contemporaries or immediate successors, and he argues that they show a better grasp of non-deductive reasoning than Hume does. Frankly, if you were to adjudge it just in terms of the debate, they won. And in fact, here's something that I can't confirm any more directly, but Alexander Campbell, no relation to George, the American theologian and debater, said that he had heard it from some people who were among Hume's friends during Hume's lifetime, that George Campbell's dissertation on miracles was brought up, and Hume admitted the Scotch theologue had defeated him. That's as far back as I've been able to trace it. I won't place a great deal of weight on it. I sure wish he had said it in public, in some more public way. But how about the ignorance and barbarism? Well, Campbell, George retorts, that in the Quran, Muhammad makes no claim to work public miracles. In fact, he's very explicit about not working public miracles. Now, by Toland's and Hume's criterion, that would have been the perfect time to pull it off. You got a bunch of backward, incredulous people around. Go for it. But he didn't. And as Sherlock notes, I don't have this down in a slide, just a few years before Hume was born, a group of Camisard prophets decided to go out on a limb. And one of their members having died, they predicted that he would rise from the dead on a stated day at Bun Hill Fields, and anyone who wanted to see the miracle might come out and watch him rise from the dead and clothe himself and deliver some profitable words. This occurs in England, in Hume's own time. Miracle claims, at least the promise of it, or certainly not something that were foreign to Hume's own time. So one wonders just how far advanced would the civilization have had to have been if in Hume's own time these kinds of things could be promoted in England. I'll add, for those of you who want to know a good story, that the stated day came around, and so did a large crowd of unruly people, some of them carrying pitchforks, and Thomas Ems did not rise from the dead, and Sir John Lacey later published a broadsheet insisting that it was just because of the lack of faith of the people, otherwise it would have happened. True story. All right, but Hume's got another string to his bow. He sketches some accounts of purported miracles outside of the canonical Christian scriptures, and he suggests that their affidavits are in various respects as good as one could wish for. Now, you'll remember these. There are the healings ascribed by Suetonius and Tacitus to the Emperor Vespasian. There's a miracle at Saragossa where a man who had lost his leg was said to have had the leg restored. There was a series of healings attributed to the efficacy of the tomb of the Abbé Paris in France, a Jansenist saint. Voltaire had some comical things to say about that particular thing. But let's go to another one of Hume's contemporaries who answered him in his own lifetime and whose work Hume read, William Adams. In his essay in answer to Mr. Hume's essay on miracles, he says, "There's a wide difference betwixt establishing false miracles by the help of a false religion and establishing a false religion by the help of false miracles. Nothing is more easy than the former of these, or more difficult than the latter." What Adams has in view is the common practice of infidels in his time of putting Protestants and Catholics by the ears by saying, well, hey, the Catholics have all of these crazy miracles in ecclesiastic history, and they've got lots and lots of affidavits for them, and they're even better off than the resurrection, so you Protestants don't believe those, you shouldn't believe the resurrection either. The comeback was that when things are worked in the interest of an entrenched and established religious position, then they might suffer to pass without being investigated to the bottom. But that wasn't the case in Jerusalem in the first century among the Jews. Where do we go with all of this? Trent is showing me the largest possible number over here, and it's 5, so I'll wrap up fast. First, I would say a word of caution for philosophers. Eloquence, we are told by a high authority, when in its highest pitch, leaves little room for reason or reflection, but addressing itself entirely to the fancy or the affections, captivates the willing hearers and subdues their understanding. I hope no one can accuse me of cherry-picking here, since I'm quoting from David Hume. And a more general piece of advice, which we might be more aware of if we read our classics from Francis Bacon. We have set it down as a law to ourselves to examine things to the bottom and not to receive upon credit or reject upon improbabilities until there hath passed a due examination. Thank you. Said examination is about to commence.
Okay, questions? No defenders of Hume?
Oh, come on, Evan's got his hand up.
Evan Fales, Iowa.
Well, it's a little hard to formulate a question because there's a long conversation. But let me just ask you for a little bit more on the point that that last point about that William Adams makes. This is a historical question, essentially, rather, I guess, than a philosophical one. But so what is exactly the evidence here that the early Christians were under pressure of some sort of serious investigation into their miracle claims? We do have gospel stories in which doubts are raised about the powers behind Jesus' exorcisms in Matthew 12 and so on. But I wonder just how well that could really be fleshed out.
Great question. I would suggest that the best place to start in looking at that would be the first 4 or 5 chapters of part 1 of Paley's View of the Evidences of Christianity. At the head of every chapter, he has a proposition which runs, there is satisfactory evidence that many professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings voluntarily undergone in attestation of the accounts they delivered, and that from the same motive they submitted themselves to new rules of conduct. And then Paley approaches the whole thing in a series of steps. First, he says, before we even look at any evidence, what should we expect of a religion professing to be the one true exclusive religion? What should we expect from the surrounding authorities, the Romans and the Jews, the pagan philosophers and the pagan people? What should we expect in the way of their reception of it? Then he says, what do we find in the way of pagan testimony to the fact? And he brings in the evidence of Tacitus from Annals 1544 regarding the treatment of the Christians as scapegoats for the fire that broke out in Rome in the fall of 64. He brings in the evidence of Suetonius, of Martial, of Juvenal, Marcus Aurelius. So he brings together what can be brought to bear on that, and then moves on to the indirect evidence within the Christian scriptures, including the Pauline epistles and even the Catholic epistles, which, whatever you may think of their authorship, are at least documents showing us what kind of view of the matter was current in the first century. And they're full of exhortations to steadfastness under trial. They don't read like things where everything's going well and everybody is just rejoicing and the congregations are growing and we're all prosperous. These are people who are under duress, and sometimes very direct duress. And then he comes to the direct evidence from the book of Acts, for example, or from more express statements of Paul's in 2 Corinthians regarding what he endured. In every way, at every level, whether you look at this antecedent to the evidence or from the non-Christian evidence or from the Christian side, looking at the indirect and the direct evidence, at every point, Paley covers this, and I think he makes an absolutely convincing case that this was bound to be opposed, and to be opposed forcefully, and that every scrap of evidence we have indicates that indeed it was.
Do you have a follow-up, Evan?
It's just, I wasn't questioning that there was early opposition to the Christians. The question was, what evidence is there that this took the form of attempts to show that Christian miracle stories were false?
Well, there's Pliny's letter to the Emperor Trajan and Trajan's rescript, which you can find in the 10th book of Pliny's letters, where he says, I've given some of them the option of abjuring this superstition, and if they abjure it and they'll pour a libation to the emperor, then I'll let them go. That seems to have taken place without any imperial edict upon the point, because otherwise that would undermine the whole point of Pliny's writing to the emperor. If there's already an existing law, simply enforce it. But there apparently is not, and yet this was the option that they were offered, was of being delators, as it were, people willing to give up on it. More than that, we're bound by the evidence we have, and I don't want to overpress that. I think there's a good historical case. I think one of the compelling things about it is that there's not a scrap of evidence to the contrary, and that's interesting considering how relatively much evidence we have, much of it from the Christians themselves, but also consonant with what we have from outside.
Jerry Walls?
Yeah, one of the arguments Hume uses that I think does seem more plausible, at least when you present it in his terms, is in terms of relative probability, in terms of relative frequency. So when he points out everybody's seen people lie lots of times, and everybody's seen people make honest mistakes lots of times, and he says, but how many times have you witnessed a miracle? So you got, I've seen this dozens of times, I've seen this zero. Okay?
Right.
So if I'm given a miracle report, okay, given the relative frequencies, wouldn't a rational person, as Hume puts it, always reject the greater miracle? So how would you respond to that kind of argument in terms of relative frequencies?
Right. I think
If you haven't yourself witnessed a miracle.
Yeah, the relative frequencies argument presumes that testimony constitutes a homogeneous reference class. And that's the first place that Hume's own contemporaries went to contest that idea. They said, look, not all testimony is on a par. We have seen people testify falsely when there are circumstances under which it's easy to be deceived. We have seen people testify falsely when they stand to gain something. But testimony against personal gain is the best kind of testimony. In fact, Voltaire himself says this expressly, that when someone who stands to lose by testifying testifies anyway, that there is great credit for. And here I'll just come back to one of those epigrams. I think it's from Marshall, who says that it requires more courage to accept a pitched shirt to be burned, a reference, it appears, to the way that people were killed in Nero's garden parties, than it does to just stick one's hand into the pan of coals and burn just the hand. If you stand to lose a lot and you maintain your position, that is not just testimony to be thrown in a pan with others and pulled out at hazard. Some kinds of testimony are far more compelling than others, and Hume's contemporaries did quite a lot of work trying to sort that out and making the case that the testimony we had, at least in the case of the resurrection, was not ordinary and was not the sort of testimony that anyone had ever seen falsified. There's a large literature on this, too. We can talk later about that.
So I'd like to interject a question in here. So consider the following sort of case. I come up to you, and I say, Tim, the Virgin Mary appeared to me, and she told me that despite how great I thought I was, I'm really have been a very bad person, full of sin, a great
I'm
sinner.
sold.
And then she says, and your penalty, your penance, is to give Tim McGrew all your worldly possessions. And then I bring out my documents and I sign I say, I'll sign my house over to you, I'll sign my car over to you, here's my bank account. Now I know what you would do.
I had no idea there was such an honorarium for this conference. This is beautiful.
Check is in the mail. But I know what you'd do, or what you'd be tempted to do. But the question is, what would you believe about the proposition that the Virgin Mary told me those things?
That's a fair question. I would certainly believe that you were persuaded that something had happened. The difficulty is that in that case, at least as I'm hearing you're telling it, it seems that the appearance was a private thing. It's one thing for an appearance to happen in a vision to one person, unusual but not unheard of. It's another thing for a group of people all to be persuaded in the same direction, and that not just, well, does it look like the sun is moving back and forth a little bit, not dancing sun kinds of things, but actually matters of extended polymodal interactions with a deceased friend whom they knew intimately and with whom they had been conversing within the week. That's a different matter entirely, and there's literature on this. Charles Leslie, has got a set of 4 criteria that he lays out, one of which is that the fact in question must be an object of sense, and it must be such as is not just privately displayed. More than one person encounters it. And he discusses things like Muhammad splitting the moon in a dream which no one else was there to see. And he says those lie out of the case. Paley also, at the end of Proposition 1, actually in Proposition 2 in Part 1 of his evidences, has a discussion of 10 different sorts of things not to be compared with a public miracle, and what you're mentioning here would fall into several of those categories.
Sure, but suppose that Linda Zegzebski and Alex Pruss and John Greco all say they were there too, and so
I would take it seriously even without the giving of your worldly goods. If enough people who I think are people both of good character and of good sense all confirm something like this, and if it's the sort of thing that is of significance, religious significance, where one can say, look, this isn't just, some people saying they saw a centaur trotting down Piccadilly, as Thomas Henry Huxley once put it. This is not a detached, one-off crazy event with no significance. If it's something of real significance, does anybody think that we have too much light from philosophy alone on the existence of God? Or on sin? Or on repentance? Christianity professes to fill up a felt gap. And that itself is the sort of place where if you expected God to act at all, that's where it would be. And this, again, is an argument that's put forward by many, Douglas and Paley and Leland and others of this time.
Other questions? Ted?
So I have a question about, just really simple question about how many independent testimonies do you think you have to the resurrection? So sometimes when you give someone an argument from testimony to a resurrection, they'll say things like this, that we don't have the actual reports themselves, right? What we have is sort of a secondhand report of the testimonies. And so if you're really concerned with the independence of the testimonies, you want to say something, right, that guarantees that the testimonies are indeed independent. So I was just wondering, you've thought a lot about this. How many independent testimonies do you think we have?
Right. So let me say just a couple of things here. First of all, models like this are designed to address a particular kind of challenge. The sorts of evidence that we have are not restricted to people claiming to have been eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus. There's a lot of other collateral evidence, several dozen different branches of this. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I know you're going to talk to us about this some at the end of the conference, is when you've got lots of different kinds of arguments and they all point in the same direction, what should that do to your thinking about it? I am not content to rest on a minimal facts approach. I want to go more maximal facts. I think that there is good evidence. Bauckham provides an excellent example of this, that we can actually see, say, in Luke, by the way that he brackets some of the pericopes that he gives us, by naming the same people, that he's using the method of inclusio and showing us who his sources were in a method that would have been understood by other writers in the genre at the time. So I am prepared on the basis of that, on the basis of various incidental confirmations in the texts themselves, on the basis of the argument from undesigned coincidences, to take a forward position and say, I think that what we have here are histories to be taken very seriously. That is one long argument, to borrow Darwin's phrase. It is not something that can be done on the back of a postcard. But as for how many independent witnesses, I take the testimony of Matthew and of John as disciples very seriously. I take the testimony of Mark as a record of Peter very seriously. Luke doesn't profess to have been an eyewitness of it, but just for that reason, he gives us a sort of different take on what somebody thought who talked with many people within living memory and collated much of what they said. And I think Luke has been shown to be an extraordinarily trustworthy witness, especially when his narrative opens out in the book of Acts to a wider surface area of the Roman Republic, and we can find that he gets detail after detail after detail. Right, I think Colin Hume gives a list of 84 of these. It's a very extensive, multi-stranded argument.
Robin, is your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, that's going to have to be the last question because we have to change our audiovisual setup for the interview.
I'm wondering how many kind of cross comparisons you've done, like, okay, with Hinduism, where they claim a lot of different sorts of miracles, or I remember when I was a teenager, my mother was involved in Christian Science. You've got the Christian Science Quarterly or something equivalent. They have always testimonies about faith healing that
Right.
are verified by a doctor or something, and I don't, subscribe to Christian Science, so either I think that there's maybe just some psychological power people have for this to happen, or that there's some other explanation. So have you looked at that?
I have done a certain amount of that. For the non-Western religious traditions, I'm relying on a friend of mine who's a doctorate in the area and has lived in the East for decades and speaks several of the languages, David Marshall. And what he has told me is consistent with what I've seen with respect to other things, that there are always miracle stories once a religious tradition is well entrenched and underway. But that's fine. But the difficulty is, and this I'm going to come back to John Douglas's line from the criterion, his third criterion for separating true from false miracle reports is that there's room for doubt if they might have suffered to pass without very careful examination, even if they had been false. And so I worry always about things that are documented only by people who are already in an entrenched, established religious tradition without fear of any significant loss for the sake of that tradition. That's always a question mark. It doesn't mean that it didn't occur, and I'm not closed a priori to the possibility of miraculous events happening outside of the Christian tradition either. But yeah, I've done some cross-comparison.
Have you looked for cases where, like, a new sect or?
Yeah, Conyers Middleton spent the latter half of his life trying to find something that would meet Leslie's 4 conditions, and apparently he confessed he couldn't do it. So there is work on this. I can give you some references later.
Very good, very good.
Thank you.